Welcome to our second interview with Peter Litchfield.
Our second interview.
The second interview.
When was our first?
Our first. Our second is our interview, meaning the second interview of keynote speakers
Okay. Right.
on the conference.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So, you said in the workshop that breathing is just one type of behavior, and
Yes.
there's plenty of behavior. And you also were talking about how important this kind of behavior, how important the breathing behavior in general for health, for our physiology is. I was wondering about your personal interest, because you have so much experience, so many years of professional work around breath work. What triggered your interest? What sparked your interest in breath in the beginning when you had no idea how potentially powerful this work could be?
Right. Yeah. When I first used to think about breathing, to me breathing was, people who did breath work was about relaxation and manipulating the breath to achieve certain kinds of objectives that usually had to do with negative kinds of situations, like around people who were stressed, people who were, had a life that needed to be brought in a downward direction so that it was like de-stressing. And for me in my own life, as I explained, my life has never been about de-stressing, it's been about stressing. I like it, I like stimulation, I like challenge, I love adventure. I've been that way all my life, doing my aviation, doing all the different kinds of businesses, doing, all kinds of things I've done in my life. So breathing didn't seem interesting to me. It just seemed like that wasn't for me. And, but one day, a friend of mine came, who's now a major leader in the field, and he was new to all this back in 1984, and he brought an instrument, a capnometer, and I was doing biofeedback training programs, because we were the #1 biofeedback training organization in the United States. And then we were the largest provider of professional education in psychology in the country. We developed this institute. And so my friend, he was going to do a lecture, showed up with this instrument. And I said, well, what's that? He said, well, it's going to measure your CO2 level. And I said, well, for what? And so he connected me, I remember. And I said, well, what did you find? He said, well, you're normal. And I said, what is that? What's that? And then he said, well, don't you remember your basic physiology? I said, what do you mean? Don't you remember you said about the whole physiology around oxygen and carbon dioxide and all of that? Do you have any memory? And I said, yeah, I had that. That's a long time ago. And it was something that was just academic. I just memorized it, took my exams, and passed down. But then he showed me these statistics about how many people were suffering with symptoms from dysfunctional kinds of chemistry, breathing chemistry. And I was flabbergasted. I just couldn't believe this could be true, these statistics. And then also, that was one thing, but at the same time I was very unhappy about what was going on in the field of biofeedback, if you know about feedback. And I came from the tradition where biofeedback came from, and it was all conditioning research. It was all learning, physiological learning is where it came from. And then what people did in biofeedback, they forgot all that stuff. They just never, I don't think they even understood it. They just took it and used it as kind of these simple techniques to help people do things, which were useful in certain cases, like EMG biofeedback and that kind of thing. And it just was boring to me, and didn't seem very, it was anything but adventure, and it seemed like a lot of pseudoscience, and then suddenly this breathing stuff was amazing. It was no pseudoscience, it was solid, really solid, non-controversial physiology that could be integrated with non-controversial, well-established behavioral science in this very exciting kind of a way. So that was like another adventure for me. That's what it was for me. To really get into something that was controversial, in the sense that when you talked about it, people were unhappy about what you had to say, when you'd say, well, deep breaths aren't so good for you. And people would be upset by that. And that was kind of an adventure for me. And I could say, well, deep breath can lead to all these problems in chemistry and can set the stage for a serious problem. And so I enjoyed that. I enjoyed just sparring with people and with concepts. I'm very conceptually oriented. So to me, in my life, I've done what we call conceptual art. It's artistic to me to do conceptual things. Most people think of it as all analytical and it's all cut and dried and mathematical. In reality, for me, it's an adventure, it's an artistic form of being involved with life. And I think that you're the same way. You have that the conceptual part is an artistic thing. And so that's,
the way I perceive your approach is very comprehensive, with including the psychology, the physiology, the chemistry, and also, is very, without having established a sound conceptual understanding of the interlinkages,
right.
this is completely impossible. And it links to the question, a question I wanted to ask you, because I was talking about this mind-body connection at the very beginning of the lecture series.
Yes, right.
And the mind-body dichotomy.
Right.
And
I remember that.
and I was thinking, because when I was going through your slides, and there were a lot of moments when I was thinking, that's an interesting way to think about that. And that's an interesting way to transcend, to overcome that. So I wanted to ask you to describe in your own words how to describe in terms of your behavioral approach, this distinction between the body and the mind.
Well, so for me, physiology, all physiological process is by definition behavior to me. And it changes as a function of how the system collects information. And it might be a cell that collects information. It might be a collection of cells. It might be an organ system. It might be a relationship between organs. It might involve the brain, it might not. And it collects, that living things collect information and living things use that information. And so it, by its very nature, is a psychological phenomenon. So many people think of psychology as being about the brain. When for me, psychology is about life. It isn't just about the brain. It's about a living system and how it self-regulates and how it moves through time and space, maintaining itself and recreating itself all the time. And that process of recreation is psychological. That's what it is. And so it was, when life first formed for me, that was the beginning of psychology at that moment. And so that it was motivated. And you talk about survival, you talk about its motivation. So then that takes you into all the other psychological kinds of things you can talk about. And then you can do a good job making a prediction about how a physiological system works. What it does. You do a much better job than just doing an anatomical kind of plumbing approach. You can't really understand what it's doing. So even from a philosophy of science perspective, because I know you're interested in that, and you're talking about the usefulness of the theory, that it becomes much more useful to talk about physiology in psychological terms, because you understand more, but you can make better predictions about it. If you want to stay on that level, you can go to other levels, which I have no problem doing, but just staying on that level by itself takes you to a vastly higher level, or I'm not sure the word's higher, but a more complex understanding of how this physiological system evolves itself and moves forward. It brings in epigenetics. You get into epigenetics because you get hormone functioning, and you look at learning, and you have all kinds of it's a huge field, hormone functioning and learning. And so as you change hormone functioning through learning different habits, then you have an epigenetic input. That behavior has an epigenetic input, which then becomes part of, you can move from there into evolution itself, from epigenetic to genetic, and see how behavior and motivation and the whole psychological process evolve, it moves right into the whole area of evolution as well. And then it becomes that much more much richer and exciting to do that. And then there's consciousness that's in there, and then it becomes a question of what is the consciousness? Just because I'm not conscious of what something's going on in my body doesn't mean that there isn't some form of consciousness there. So it's just that it's part of my body, so I claim it, and I may call that my unconscious because I don't feel what it's doing, but so I call it my unconscious, but in reality there may be actually some consciousness that's acting on that level, but it's mine. So that's why I call it unconscious, because it's mine. If it's not mine, like yours is not mine. So I don't call it you're not my unconscious, you're a separate consciousness.
So that is even stronger than just having an embedded concept of the mind, or where the mind and the body cannot be separated. Is more like this all-pervasive concept of learning, and this dynamic interaction between the body and the mind, which are in constant communication and in constant
physiology
co-creation.
Physiology doesn't work without mind. There is no physiology without mind. It would be dead. There'd be no self-regulation. So by its very essence, it's psychological. So if you take that out of it, it would just collapse. There wouldn't be anything there. There'd be no functioning. The functioning is psychological functioning.
So there is basically there is not so much that we could argue is stable in the system or in the organism.
Right.
But what is stable in your way of thinking about breathing and about thinking about health and thinking about physiology is the pH level.
Well, it's a fundamental piece of chemistry that's so fundamental to biology and how it works, because ions are moving through the system based on pH. So you have this, all the electrolytes that are absolutely, essential to the regulation of virtually anything you want to talk about in the body are being influenced by the way you're breathing. So it's constantly, they talk about the chemical axis I talked about.
Yeah.
And the idea is you bring in, there's a lot of variability, but you have some stability that moves, the variability moves around that stability. So the variability becomes the mechanics of the breathing, because they serve you in all kinds of ways, those mechanics. But then if you can keep the chemistry stable while you're doing that, then you've got a way for the system, in a sense, to sustain itself, that it can continue to live while it's doing all this playfulness and exploration and so on with all the mechanics, serving other functions for the organism. Like it might be that it serves me because it really allows me to cope with my emotions. For example, it might be I'm upset with someone, and the way I cope with my upsetness, I need to be assertive. So what I do is I overventilate, and what that does is it triggers anger in me. And I then use the anger as energy for encountering somebody. And if I can't get to that anger point, then I'm withdrawn and I'm hiding, you see. So by overventilating, I'm talking about a theoretical person. I know lots of clients like this, that by doing that overventilating, they get access to an emotion that empowers them, you see. So then, but meanwhile,
the overventilation or the overbreathing is you can only determine it when you have a stable idea of what is the right pH value. And when you say, okay, the pH value is not something that can change over the lifetime of a person.
Right, it doesn't, because the electrolytes will still move. Basically, that's stable. Like sodium will move. It'll be exchanged for hydrogen if the pH is right, see, and that law stays there. So if you need hydrogen ions, then you have to, breathe a certain way. Or if you want to get rid of hydrogen ions, you have to breathe a certain way, because pH is about hydrogen ion concentration. And that doesn't really change, no matter whether you're doing exercise or what, because the blood still needs that same pH, whether you're relaxed, running, excited, bored, going to sleep or whatever, it needs that, unless there's something else that overrides that's more important. Like, say, my being able to, personally, I want to cope with a situation, And so by throwing it out of alignment, it might provide me with something that I wouldn't otherwise have available to me that I can use. And then that can become addictive, and that sustains a situation that works for me.
Mm. So would you agree with the statement that is being able to avoid over-breathing is the path to finding one's center?
Yes, it is.
Where is base
Yes.
emotionally or in terms of personality?
Precisely. I would call it balanced breathing. And the Japanese word for breath is perfect. And the Japanese word has two pictures in it. One is a picture of the heart. The other one is a picture of the self. And the breath brings together the heart and the self in Japanese.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
Okay.
picture.
And
Yeah.
so that is when you have good chemistry, they come together. When you throw the chemistry off, you dissociate. You disconnect. And maybe that serves you, but you disconnect. So the heart and the self move apart, see? So breathing that isn't good in Japanese would be where the self and the heart move apart.
Yeah.
And when the heart and self come together, then this is the true breath, you see, in Japanese.
Your work and your presentation, in my perception, has like puzzled a lot of the participants, or has challenged them in a way to say, okay, what does this imply for my work, or how can I benefit from these insights? And one of the questions that was arising for me is that a lot of breath workers have come across this idea of coherence. And
Do most breath workers even know about coherence?
I hope so.
Well, I think you do, but I'm not sure that I never hear them talking about that. Maybe because you're around them, I'm not, so.
Yeah, I was talking with somebody during the dinner, and she was also talking about coherence. And I was wondering if there is a literature, or if you, in your personal experience, if there is a connection between coherence and over-breathing.
Well, you see, in the coherence, if you're talking about the heart rate variability stuff,
Yeah.
you can use breathing to bring together these frequencies. And theoretically, bringing those frequencies together can do helpful things to people. So now it's an intervention where you're coming in to breathe a certain way, to bring these waves together, which then come, they create a larger wave, and somehow this plays some role in health, or at least in health. And so it's similar to the traditional way of thinking about breathing, is where you manipulate it to bring about some positive change, rather than looking at it. Looking at it is not something to manipulate, but it's something that is part of who you are. And a lot of times who we are isn't so good. We want to be different, and so you change the breathing so it fits more the Japanese model of what breathing is, and then the idea of being functional, so that you're serving the cells in your body. I mean, you don't want to be suffering with ischemia. Ischemia is where you have anemia in a tissue. I mean, you don't want anemia in a tissue, because the tissue will die. You don't want that. And you don't want breathing that's triggering something, where your jaw alignment is going to go wrong. You're a child, and now your jaw is going to be out of alignment. You're going to have problems. You don't want that. So you don't want to just have an intervention. You want to have a whole style of breathing that doesn't provide for something like that to happen.
Okay. So from your experience, you can't see a correlation between coherence
To me, it's a form of
the reduction of over-breathing.
It's a separate
thing.
It's a separate thing. It's being used as a tool, as you pointed out one time.
Yeah.
It's a tool.
Yeah.
And then also, if it were built into self-regulation, I mean, it's not realistic to think in the remotest sense that you're going to run around breathing at 6 breaths per minute so you can integrate these two frequencies. I mean, we just don't breathe at that rate. We breathe at whatever rate we need to, given what we're doing. And so the idea that that's where you need to be is a foolish thought to me. It's not where you need to be. It's whatever what's relevant to what you're doing at the time. And if you're trying to do something that requires the merging of the resonant frequency, well, then you can do that if somehow it's playing a role in something that matters to you. Or maybe you automatically do it under certain circumstances. You go into this resonant frequency situation automatically at certain places and times, and that would be a self-regulation that would be going on, you know, if you could do that. But people don't seem to talk about that. They just talk about aligning them, you know.
Yeah, and you could like talking about HRV, you could normatize the HRV value with the heart rate, which will also give you a better indication for high heart rate activities, not just having this idea of all, in order to have a high coherent degree of coherence, you always have to have a low heart rate, and you can only do low heart rate activities or low heart rate things in your life.
Right.
Yeah. And in practical terms, it's like, for me, it's like I wanted to ask you about practical implications, because we're doing this pilot project. So we're using your machinery to do a pilot study in transformational breathing, which is like applying your approach to a completely different, to a specific breathing technique, which is transformational breathing. So do you consider this as a way to link your insights with existing breathwork approaches and breathwork techniques, or how
Well, that
do you think that can be, how that
sure,
can work?
Yeah, because a lot of it has to do with, say, interviewing somebody, you know, and sharing phenomenological information, because our work is really phenomenological, where a person is sharing what's going on, and so where they're exploring, you know, the motivations and, you know, the emotions and everything that's associated with the breathing. And you can't get anywhere without that exploration. So you can bring that into transformational kinds of breathing, where in this research that we're talking about, then you can, you know, interview the person, find out what they're feeling, and as they move into it, as they're in it, what happens over a period of time, what happens when they discontinue it. I mean, you can bring in the person and their phenomenological experience and see how, you know, transformational kinds of breathing could play a role in their lives, or how it is playing a role, how it might play a role, you know, where you really explore, you help the individual, you guide them in exploring themselves, and in so doing, you learn about them, and you learn more about breathing and how the process of breathing by being with them as they go through that exploration. And then you facilitate that exploration, and it builds, and it can become a creative kind of a process, you see. So there's no incompatibility there. In fact, what we do, because I noticed in this transformational breathing, there's a lot of overventilating. What we do in testing, you see, we have a whole section that we do in our training in testing. And the testing has to do with what you find in the two forms that we use, and also what we find in the interview and the physiology that we observe during the initial part of the interview. And then we create, and also the questionnaire we use and the checklist, we then create a plan for testing, where we try to create a situation where the individual can actually experience breathing in a way that then becomes revealing in terms of the kind of habit they have and how they're being affected by that habit. And one of the things we will do very often is have them lower their carbon dioxide on purpose. And so then we will coach them into a particular level. We don't automatically go down to a specific level. We will coach them down to a level where we can see that they're experiencing something. There's no need to go way down. If you already have all kinds of changes, say at 32 millimeters as opposed to 22, you stop there. And you work with a person there, you bring them down, you coach them there, you talk to them about things that you've learned about them. It's not just random stuff. They've told you about some history of what's happened. They've told you about when they have certain symptoms, and then you bring that into your conversation when their CO2 levels down, and we have them focus internally on themselves without responding, say, to me, and I have them think about the things that I learned about them, and I have them think about it. Does it remind them of when they're in a certain situation? Does it remind them of something that happened at a particular time? You know, what thoughts are coming to their mind, what emotions are coming to their mind, certain specific symptoms that I learned about when I had the interview, and I asked them about those symptoms, and I put them through this process, and then I have them sit back and rest easy, the same way you do like this conformational breathing thing, where afterwards they just sit for a while, and I watch to see, I engage them then in their experience. I ask them about their experience, and then as they come back, a lot of times they won't come back, they get trapped. And they'll say, I'm really feeling bad. I can't seem to feel any better. I can't seem to get out of this. I don't know what's happening here. And I know I'm not doing that anymore, but I'm trapped. I don't know what to do. Okay? And so that becomes something that they experience in their lives, where they breathe that way and they get trapped. And then they're just a basket case. They're just absolutely, they're ready to call the doctor. They don't know what's going on, and they're trapped. So they experience being trapped. So that, thinking of the conformational breathing that you were asking me about, in some ways it's similar, because the person starts normal and goes way down, and then they may come back or they may not. But there needs to be a discussion with that. For me, there needs to be closure. That person needs to know they're not back. We need to ask them about their what emotions are they feeling. I don't want someone to go home with a low CO2 level. So I asked them, well, what are you feeling right now? I just feel, I'm just so disoriented. I feel so dizzy, and it's making me very anxious, and I just don't know what to do. I don't leave them like that. I then work with them to get the level back to normal, so that they feel fine when they leave, you see. So I want to know everything personal about that in the work. I mean, you can see there was some personal things going on with the woman who was there. You know, you get really personal about it, and it helps them a lot to be able to describe their experience.
Thanks, Peter, for sharing your work with us here at this conference.
You're welcome.
And thanks for all your inspiration. And I think there have been a lot of elements that have been, in a way, inspiring in you. And yeah, thanks for all of
Sure.
that.
Thank you.